Welcome to Part 3 of The Music of Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 9. I'm glad you could come so quickly, McCarty. Eustace Ellison's usually vibrant face had turned pale, and the playful smile that usually danced beneath his sandy mustache had faded into a worried frown. Your inspector figured I had some information regarding that valet's death when I called headquarters for your address, and I didn't correct him. I want to avoid any scandal while there's still a cloud of uncertainty hanging over us. But good heavens, I'm genuinely worried. Do you remember Special Deputy Riordan from our initial discussion at Orbits? McCarty gestured toward his partner, who stood in the doorway. You mentioned over the phone that your son had been kidnapped. Surely he's too big for that, especially in the middle of the day. What other explanation can we have? Ellison threw up his hands in desperation. Horry disappeared without a trace this afternoon. He had no intention of going out. He mentioned a headache after lunch, and he's never been the healthiest. His mother left him curled up on the couch in the library when she went out shopping. She came back late and didn't check on him, thinking he was with Camden, his tutor. I returned home from the club around 5:30 and found Camden in quite a state of distress. But here he is. He can explain it better himself. Mr. Camden, these are the gentlemen I called for. Could you tell them when you first noticed Horry was missing? The thin, anxious young man with glasses, who they had seen speaking with the watchman earlier, stepped forward slowly. I went to the library at 3 to remind him it was time for his Latin lesson, he began, his voice shaky and bewildered. He wasn't there, so I searched the house, surprised that he would go out without saying a word. Then I thought he might have slipped next door to Mr. Orbitt's house. He's fascinated by the remarkable collection of paintings there. His greatest dream is to become an artist, and Mr. Orbitt has always encouraged him, but I'm rambling. I went there to ask about him, but no one had seen him. Growing increasingly anxious, I asked the watchman, who assured me that Nathan hadn't left through either gate. Oh, McCarty said, watching as Marcus shifted his feet uncomfortably. What did you do next, Mr. Camden? I figured Nathan must have gone to see the artist who's been teaching him to draw, someone he has really taken a liking to. Nothing else made sense to explain his sudden absence. It seemed likely that a neighbor with a key to the mall could have entered just as he left, meaning the watchman wouldn't have had to open the gate for him. The young man's hands were clenched nervously, and beads of sweat had formed on his forehead. So, I didn't mention it to Mrs. Ellison before she went to the musicale. I thought he would be back any moment. As the afternoon wore on, I searched the house again, asked the servants, even went over to the Rene house to ask if they had seen him. Young Mr. Rene had been interested in Nathan's artistic pursuits too, and it's the only other house on the block that Nathan is allowed to visit by himself, since the Burminsters are still away. I found nothing. If only I had raised the alarm sooner. He turned away with a groan when McCarty asked, Why didn't you think to call Blaisdell and ask if the boy had been there, Camden? The distraught tutor stared blankly, and Ellison, who had been leaning against the mantel with his head in his hands, suddenly turned around. How did you know Blaisdell is the artist giving him lessons? He demanded. McCarty smiled knowingly. I heard the boy say himself that Blaisdell is going on a sketching tour next month and planned to take him along, but you wouldn't hear of it, he explained. The boy was eager to go. Blaisdell left yesterday, the tutor interjected. I found out when I called his studio this afternoon, as soon as I thought Nathan might have gone there. I can't believe I neglected to mention it, my anxiety. I feel utterly irresponsible for having treated the situation so lightly. Does the boy never get a chance to play with other kids? Marcus asked for the first time, his voice dripping with condescending pity. Couldn't he have gone to the park and then home for supper with one of them? My son does not play in the park, Ellison replied, maintaining his composure. He rides there with a class from the academy 2 mornings a week, but the season doesn't reopen until next month. Nathan is delicate, as I've mentioned, and he's never been fond of rough physical activity, though he is hardly fragile. He has a few friends his age, but they're all still at their country homes. Mr. Camden and I have called everyone we could think of. Mrs. Ellison is completely distraught and under the doctor's care. When she returned from Orbit's musicale and learned of Nathan's disappearance, she was nearly out of her mind. He's our only child, after all, if anything has happened to him. He raked his hand through his thinning hair, and McCarty noted, "It's strange the lad didn't tell you himself that Blaisdell was leaving yesterday." "He hasn't spoken much about him lately," Ellison admitted reluctantly. "Nathan is an unusual boy, very sensitive and reserved. I can't pretend to fully understand him. He took our refusal to let him go on that sketching trip very hard, but it was simply out of the question. No one but an artist would think of suggesting such an impractical idea for a boy of his age and health. Damn that dog. He's going to drive me insane." A mournful, drawn-out whine, quiet yet full of meaning, floated up from downstairs, and McCarty recalled his brief conversation with the boy in this very room 3 days earlier. "Is that Max, the police dog your son mentioned when I was here?" "Yeah, he kept wandering around, whining, until I couldn't take it any more and had to put him away. He's an incredibly smart dog and really devoted to Hori. He knows something's wrong. Good heavens, listen to that. It's midnight. What could have happened to my boy?" He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands as the clock chimed, and Marcus spoke again. "Do you have any idea how much pocket money the kid had today?" Camden answered him. $6.75. I'm teaching him to keep track of his spending, and he diligently notes down whatever he spends each day. Small and red-headed, wasn't he, with a slim build and spindly legs? What Riordan means is he's small for his age and somewhat delicate-looking, McCarty corrected hastily, shooting a glare at the insensitive questioner. How was he dressed when you last saw him, and what's missing from his belongings? He was wearing a brown suit, brown shoes, and golf stockings, the tutor replied. He had a simple platinum wristwatch with a leather strap, and a gold seal ring with the family crest. The only other thing missing is a brown cap with Knowles printed inside. Before I reached out to you, Mr. Ellison and I called every hospital in the city, worried there might have been an accident on the street, but no child matching his description has been admitted. The only other possibility is that he's being held somewhere for ransom. Do you have any other reason to suspect the boy might have been kidnapped? McCarty turned to Ellison. Do you know anyone who might hold a grudge against you or your family? Have any letters threatening him? Good heavens, no. The grief-stricken father looked up. Hori is just a little guy for his age, only 14, though he seems closer to 12. Mr. Camden usually goes with him when he leaves the mall, but he pleaded so earnestly to visit Blaisdell's studio on his own that I gave in, despite his mother's disapproval. I wanted him to be brave and independent, and the Madison Avenue cars stop right by Blaisdell's near 50th. I thought it was completely safe, but he might have been watched and targeted by someone with ill intentions. That still doesn't clarify how he could have slipped out of either gate without anyone noticing, McCarty replied, shaking his head. You mentioned wanting to avoid any publicity. Otherwise, I'd suggest filing a report with the Bureau of Missing Persons and letting the investigation follow its usual path. But there's still a chance he hasn't been kidnapped or gotten into any trouble. It's up to Riordan and me to find him and bring him back quietly, without the papers blowing this up into a huge story, as per your request tonight. Marcus gasped slightly at this unusual suggestion, but Ellison nodded vigorously. Yes, exactly. It would devastate Mrs. Ellison if the media turned this into a sensational scandal, while there's still a glimmer of hope that Nathan can come back to us without the world knowing. You'll do everything you can. I'll pay any amount, a fortune, to have my son back, safe and sound. We'll do our best, Mr. Ellison, McCarty said as he stood up. If we don't have any news for you by morning, may we speak with Mrs. Ellison then? Of course. I take you to her now, but the doctor has given her something to calm her nerves. The servants don't know anything. I've questioned them until I'm exhausted and reached out to everyone who might have seen Hori. For God's sake, please find my boy. Young Camden showed them out, and McCarty observed the worried look on his pale face as he held the door open. He looked as though he was about to speak, but then glanced over his shoulder and firmly shut his lips. McCarty hesitated. "Before we arrive in the morning, you should really tell the boy's father to be honest with us," he urged in a quiet voice. "Holding back something won't help him." Camden jumped at that. "Do you really think he is?" he replied quickly. "I've shared everything I know, but if there's more I can do, just let me know. I'll stay up all night by the phone." "Where are we headed now?" Marcus asked, as his companion turned towards the east gate. "We were appointed as deputies to find out who killed Griffith, not to chase after runaway kids, but I'm right behind you." "Runaway is what you think. That's certainly what it sounded like when you inquired about the lad's pocket money, and then described him so bluntly," McCarty laughed. "Do you think he's run off to join that artist fellow, Blaisdell? We'll figure that out easily once we learn where that tour was supposed to start, since Nathan can't have gone far with just $6.75. "And we know how he got out," Marcus added. "It was through that east gate when James left it open conveniently. Look at Orbert's house. Do you reckon his afternoon party is still going strong?" The awning and carpet were still laid out from the entrance to the curb, and it seemed that the soft glow filtering through the curtained windows of the conservatory carried with it faint organ music. But it wasn't a grand melody this time. It was a simple, repetitive tune. McCarty paused to listen, shaking his head. "Orbit, just by himself, lost in thought at the organ. Can't you tell by the way he's just meandering along, entertaining himself? It's an easy little tune too, one that you'd easily remember. Come on." "I have a feeling we should check out the parts of this mall we haven't looked at yet. If there's any inch of it we haven't covered, aside from the insides of the other houses," Marcus started, clearly disappointed. "I thought we'd be tracking down whoever manages Blaisdell's place to find out where he's gone." "At this hour," McCarty scoffed. "Have you considered that Ellison might not be entirely wrong, especially if he has a reason to believe the boy was taken? I'm starting to understand the practical lessons in those books of mine you dismiss. Tell me, did Nathan look like the type to have the guts to run away? If he left these gates, it was certainly by his own choice, especially since James left that one open. But what if he was lured out? What if he was tricked into going outside? How do we know there aren't others involved right here in the neighborhood?" "Others involved," Marcus echoed, coming to an abrupt halt as they passed the dark Thorn house. "Ty, you can't seriously think there's a connection between what happened to Griffith 4 days ago and the Ellison kid's disappearance? You're not suggesting we might find him dead somewhere, poisoned? Good heavens, what's happening on this street all of a sudden?" "I've been asking myself that," his companion replied grimly. "I'm not drawing any conclusions yet, just saying it looks suspicious, that's all. We have a handful of wealthy families living behind their gates in peace and quiet for generations, with nothing ever happening except an occasional funeral because they can't escape death. Then a murder happens right in their midst, even if the victim had been wandering before he collapsed, and while the mystery remains unsolved, someone in the next house disappears. So that's why you mentioned notoriety. If Ellison decided to take the case to headquarters instead of leaving it to us." "We're still on the Griffith case, after all," Marcus exclaimed. "What's going on down here?" McCarty had ventured into the dark passage between Mrs. Thorne's house and the closed Falkingham residence next door. He didn't reply to Marcus, who followed closely behind him until they reached the back of the boarded-up house. Then he whispered softly, "Do you have your flashlight?" In response, Marcus pulled out the pocket-sized electric torch he rarely left behind on nighttime escapades with McCarty. McCarty took it from him, pressed the button, and shone a narrow but bright beam along the rear of the houses they had just walked by. "Do you see that, Max?" he whispered. "An open passage clear as day right past the Bellamy's and Orbit to Ellison's at the corner. If the kid wanted to sneak out unseen, he could have slipped out the back of his house and cut through this passage to any of the exits to the sidewalk near the gate." "That makes sense," Marcus agreed. Shine the light along the back wall and let's see how high it is and if there are any little doors in it. The wall, not made of brick but of old brownstone, was as high as the city codes allowed and was uninterrupted except for the back of Orbit's little mansion, which was draped in a thick, impenetrable curtain of ivy, dark and glossy like black satin in the moving beam of light. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed along the sidewalk to the entrance of the passageway they had just left, and a brighter light was suddenly aimed at them. Marcus instinctively ducked, but McCarty stood firm, calling out cautiously. "Is that you, Dave Harleys?" "We haven't left yet. We're just looking around." They had met the night watchman when they entered through the west gate earlier, responding to Eustace Ellison's call, and he merely grunted in acknowledgement as he walked by. "There's nothing more to see here," Marcus said. "No one could scale that wall without a ladder, and while they might manage to climb that ivy, they couldn't do it carrying a boy as big as Nathan. Not to mention it's broad daylight, and all the houses on this street are watching the show," McCarty added. "Still, let's take a walk down to the Goddards, kitchen door and back, Max." The back of Mrs. Thorne's mansion was as dark as the front, and the lights in Orbit's had long since been turned off. In the eerie stillness, their careful footsteps sounded uncomfortably loud to them. Only in the Ellison house did the dull glow from roof to cellar seep through the covered windows like anxious, sleepless eyes. "It's almost unsettling how clean everything is." Marcus glanced around as the flashlight swept across the spacious, pristine courtyard. "Not a single ash can, or even a garbage, can that a cat could hide behind. We're wasting our time here, Ty." But McCarty didn't respond. He had walked halfway down the tradesman's passage, leading to the sidewalk, and paused before a door in the side wall of the Ellison house. Marcus watched as the light flickered over the paved ground, then focused to a tiny point as McCarty bent down. After a moment, he straightened up and returned quietly, moving lightly despite his bulk. He held out a small object in his hand, and as he reached Marcus's side, he shone the light on it, a plain platinum watch, crushed beyond repair, attached to a sadly short leather wristband. Chapter 10. The cold, early light of a cloudy morning found McCarty and Marcus sitting over pancakes and coffee in an all-night diner on 6th Avenue near 50th Street. The hours since they left the new Queen's Mall had been spent in a weary search through ferries and train stations for any news of a small, solitary traveler. They had just come from interviewing the superintendent of the upscale apartment building where the artist Blaisdell lived, whose location a nearby pharmacist had luckily revealed. "I always thought painters lived in tiny attic rooms, barely scraping by," Marcus said, his voice slightly dazed. "I remember that day watchman James mentioning how young Nathan told him Blaisdell was one of the best in the country, but he must have some real income to afford a place like that. One thing's for sure. No matter how much he liked the kid, he wouldn't risk getting into trouble taking him out without his parents' permission. If the boy shows up, he'll definitely bring him back." "Where did you say he went sketching?" "Up in the Shawangunk Mountains," McCarty pronounced the name carefully. "Ellenville is his base, the superintendent mentioned, the Detweller house. Assuming there was a train, and the kid had more money than that four-eyed tutor thought he did, he could have made it there by early evening, but I still haven't heard anything when I called the Ellison house an hour ago." "I know," Marcus said as he drained his cup and held it out to the drowsy waiter for a refill. "It's too bad you didn't tell Camden about finding the watch." "And set him off into a panic. He's as emotional as a woman these days," McCarty shrugged. "The doctor ordered that Mrs. Ellison shouldn't be woken until 8, but will risk it by 7. How are you feeling, Max?" Marcus shot a wary glance at the person asking. "I'm fine, as far as I know." "Such a shame," McCarty replied, his tone indifferent. "I was thinking if you called the lieutenant at the engine house and told him how unwell you were, he might let you take the day off. There's a phone over by the cigar counter." "And what exactly is wrong with me?" A spark of interest lit Marcus's eyes, but his tone remained flat, as his creative spirit was still sluggish in the early morning. "Based on what I've been hearing recently about people with mental issues." But Marcus stood up and walked over to the counter, picking up the phone. Soon, McCarty heard him describing his supposed pain in a dramatic manner, but the story was abruptly cut off. After listening for a moment with a bewildered expression, he placed the receiver back down and returned to his chair. "Well?" McCarty asked, expectation etched on his face. "Mike's out of the hospital and will take my 9 to 6 shift." "But what did the lieutenant say to you?" "He told me," Marcus replied slowly and clearly, "to get off the phone, since I wouldn't be any good at a false alarm while my partner in crime, McCarty, was back on the job. I picked up from a few more comments before he hung up that your buddy Jimmy Ballard from the Bulletin has been snooping around the engine house, trying to get information from me about what you're up to, and in the process, driving the lieutenant crazy. This is what I get for associating with you." Now it was McCarty's turn to look at his companion with suspicion, but Marcus's face was expressionless and serious as he responded, "Is that so? Well, we'd better start working with the Goddards again, or there'll be no news for Jimmy or the inspector, which is even worse." "Come on." "Unless we find the boy like we did Griffith," Marcus said, trying to sound hopeful. "That might clear the Lindholms, but really, who but a madman would be poisoning children and servants without a care?" McCarty met him with a look, and a grunt that his companion took as disdainful, which made him fall into a sulky silence as they approached the gates, behind which loomed so much mystery and danger. Camden swung the door open almost before the ringing of the bell had faded, and his drawn face showed that the tension hadn't eased. "Have you?" He couldn't quite finish the question, but McCarty replied quickly. "We've got a few leads, Camden, and we're following all of them. No news is good news at this point. Do you know if Mrs. Ellison is awake yet?" "When I asked her maid a little while ago, she said Mrs. Ellison was stirring. I'll go check." The young tutor turned away with a heavy heart. "You'll find Mr. Ellison in the smoking room at the back on the avenue side." The smoking room felt more like a club lounge than a private space, filled with heavy furniture, and it took a moment for them to spot Eustace Ellison, his plump figure sunk deep into a large leather armchair. He appeared to be asleep, but as they approached, he opened his eyes wide and jumped up with a startled gasp. "We haven't found your son yet, Mr. Ellison," McCarty said quickly before the father could gather his thoughts. "We understand how precious every moment is to you, and we're bringing in the inspector and some of his men. I can assure you there will be no publicity from us." "By God, McCarty, they can publish it in every paper in the country if it will bring our boy back," Ellison exclaimed, his voice breaking. "The terror of this night has made everything else feel insignificant." "You mean to say you've failed?" "Not exactly, sir, but it's just the two of us now, and it would save time if others could follow up on some of the leads we have," McCarty explained. "There's the telephone," Ellison said, gesturing with a trembling hand toward a stand half-hidden behind a polished screen. "Call the entire department if you need to. I'll offer any reward you think is fair, 50,000, 100. We'll sort that out when the inspector arrives." McCarty moved to the screen and picked up the receiver while Marcus cleared his throat. "How many doors are there in this house?" 4, Ellison replied, sounding surprised. "There's the front door, 2 at the back, one for the kitchen and the other for tradesmen, and a smaller side door leading to the courtyard that runs between this house and Orbit. But why do you ask? What clues have you uncovered?" Marcus coughed discreetly, and from behind the screen came McCarty's voice. "Is that you, Inspector?" "Yes, it's me, McCarty. No, I'm at Ellison, and we need you here. Just a moment. Can you reach both Martin and Yast? I can't talk right now, sir. Do you get me? All right, send Martin, but have Yast go to James 565. That's it. Maybe yes, maybe no. Of course, I've been in touch with James, and he's aware of the person I'm trying to locate. Tell Yast to hold on and call me here if anything comes up." "Of course not, Inspector. Not until you take charge. Goodbye." That last part had been pure pretense, but Marcus shuddered as the receiver clicked back into place. He knew that telephone number all too well, and the grim little house by the river where, for a fleeting time, the kind-hearted James took in the city's forgotten dead. Had the frail little Ellison heir met the same fate as Griffith after all? Why did you ask about the doors? The man before them seemed to grasp only the obvious meaning of the inquiry. Nathan must have been lured out of the house somehow, for no one could have entered with Camden and all the servants present. He did leave through the side door, McCarty said, presenting the shattered wristwatch. Does this belong to the boy? My God, yes, he wore it yesterday. Ellison snatched it and then collapsed into his chair. It's ruined. He must have been treated terribly, maybe even. That doesn't follow, sir, McCarty interrupted. The strap comes loose from the buckle easily. I tried it myself. The boy might have dropped it without realizing. Anyone going to the back doors could have stepped on it afterward, since I found it in the alley right in front of that door. And now, Mrs. Ellison is awake and ready to see you, Camden said from the threshold, causing Ellison to spring to his feet once more. Does she know there's no news? He asked, and at the tutor's nod he added, Then let's go, but don't push her too hard and ignore any wild things she might say. My poor wife is nearly beside herself. Of course, we understand, McCarty said, casting a quick glance at Marcus before turning back to the tutor. Camden, Inspector Lucien, and another officer are on their way from headquarters. It would be helpful if you could tell them everything that's happened and all about those you contacted in search of the boy. In silence, they followed Ellison to the small, ornate elevator, which dazzled Marcus with its velvet, gold, and shimmering crystal mirrors. He gasped again when their guide pressed a button, and they shot upward with a sudden jolt, his weathered face turning a pale shade of green as they came to a smooth yet disorienting stop at the second floor. He was the first to step through the open door, but there was no time for the words on his lips, for Ellison led the way down the expansive hall to the doorway where an elderly maid stood, framed against the dim light of the room inside. Eustace, a woman's trembling voice came from behind her. Surely there's news. Did you inform them about that? Everything is being taken care of, Clara. Ellison gestured for the maid to step aside, and McCarty and Marcus followed him into the dressing room. They were struck by a confusing blend of mahogany furniture, soft rose hues, and tall mirrors, along with the faint scent of perfume and the sound of deep, heavy breathing. In an instant, their attention was drawn to the long figure sprawled on a chaise longue, still commanding even in her state of grief. Mrs. Ellison was a woman well into her 40s, yet her distraught face retained hints of the beauty she must have once possessed. There was no sign of grey in the thick, dark hair that the maid had hastily arranged, but the night had left its marks in the fine lines around her eyes and the delicate firmness of her mouth, marks that would not fade. As her husband continued to speak, she glanced past him at the two men waiting by his side. Everything humanly possible is being done, my dear, Ellison stressed with more urgency. These are the police officers I called in, and they have a few questions for you. Do you think you can gather yourself enough to stick to the facts and avoid any morbid fantasies? I am perfectly composed, Eustace. There was a faint hint of defiance in Mrs. Ellison's voice as she propped herself up among the pillows, exuding an unconscious dignity despite the emotion she was clearly straining to control. Ask me anything you wish. I just want my baby safe again. Of course, ma'am, McCarty replied gently. You left the boy on the couch in the library, and when you returned to get ready for the musicale next door, you thought he was with his teacher. Now, when did you first realize he was missing? It was when I got back from the musicale. It was late, after 6, and my husband met me in the hall with the news. He and Mr. Camden had been calling everywhere. They thought Nathan might have gone to one of our friends' houses, but he's never left the mall without our knowledge. I knew something terrible had happened. I could feel it, right here. Her slender, pale hands flew to her chest. I can't blame Mr. Camden for not starting the search for Nathan sooner. He thought Nathan had slipped away to see that artist who has taken a great liking to our little boy. But Mr. Blaisdell isn't even in town. Though she was trying to remain composed, her trembling hands and quick breaths betrayed her deep agitation. You don't think the boy has run off to be with him, do you? McCarty asked. Run away, you mean? Mrs. Ellison shook her head slowly. Oh, no, Nathan would never even think of such a thing. Mr. Blaisdell wanted to take him, but we wouldn't allow it, and Nathan would never dream of disobeying us. He has never been away from us, until yesterday. Then you believe he has been kidnapped? At the question, Mr. Ellison, who had moved around to the other side of the couch, stepped forward, the sagging muscles of his round face tightening as his jaw clenched, but his wife kept her gaze fixed firmly on McCarty. He isn't here, her voice quivered. He wouldn't just run away. The earth didn't open up and swallow him whole. It must have been that man. What man? McCarty and Marcus replied in unison, and Ellison placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. Now, Clara, he chided gently, you promised. To give us facts, Mr. Ellison, McCarty interrupted sharply. If Mrs. Ellison can share what you were holding back last night, that would be most helpful. You called me to say the boy had been kidnapped, but you couldn't provide any reason for that assumption other than that he was missing, and you didn't mention any man. Will you tell us, ma'am? There's nothing to tell, Ellison insisted stubbornly. My wife is just anxious, and so is Nathan. He was quite frightened by a strange man in the mall not long ago, and his mother was worried sick about it. It took days before she would let him go out alone again, but I suspect he might have exaggerated. Our boy would never lie, Mrs. Ellison interjected. It was at dusk one evening about 2 weeks ago, or maybe less, when Nathan returned home alone from Mr. Blaisdell's studio. He came in through the east gate like he always does, but stopped to play with a little white Persian kitten belonging to Mrs. Thorne's baby. Mrs. Thorne lives just 2 doors down from us, next to Mr. Orbert's. The watchman had passed him and moved toward the west gate, when suddenly the kitten darted across the street, and Nathan ran after it, worried it might get lost. It scampered into the open courtyard between the Webster house and the abandoned one next door, which belongs to the Quentin estate. Nathan was crouching down to coax the kitten when a strange man grabbed him from behind and searched him. Searched, McCarty repeated, astonished. Yes. The man pushed Nathan back against him, covering his mouth with one hand while patting down all his pockets with the other, but he took nothing and didn't say a word. My little son was too shocked to fight back at first, and suddenly the man let him go and vanished. Did the boy have any money on him? Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. $3 or $4, I think, but the man left it untouched. Mrs. Ellison's gaze met the questioner's. It was quite dark in that narrow space between the 2 houses, but Nathan clearly saw the face that leaned over him. He said the man was a complete stranger he had never seen in the mall before, rough, unshaven, and looking desperate. Which way did he go? McCarty continued with his questioning. Did he head down the alley to the street, or up into the open court behind the houses? How could the child know? Ellison interrupted before his wife could respond. It was nearly dark, and he was terrified. Nathan told us that the man ran toward the back and disappeared into the shadows of a doorway on the left, Mrs. Ellison said, seeming to ignore her husband's comment. On the left, facing the back of the houses on the north side of the street, McCarty thought aloud. That would be Webster's house, then. Why didn't you want us to know this, Mr. Ellison? Because it has no relevance to the disappearance of our son yesterday. Ellison shot back, clearly agitated. He ran home immediately and told us, and I started a thorough search without delay, but the watchman couldn't find any trace of the man and insisted he hadn't let anyone in that day who resembled Nathan's description. The Websters' servants hadn't seen anything either, and he hasn't shown up since, despite us keeping a close watch. It's pure madness to think that Nathan left this house on his own to meet that man, especially when he was so terrified of him. Unless they ran into each other by chance, and he was caught off guard again, Marcus interjected earnestly. Who knows what the man wanted if it wasn't money, but if he was unhinged, and Nathan resisted a little. Oh, Mrs. Ellison's tightly wound nerves snapped, and she erupted into a low, mournful sob. That's exactly what I fear. No rational person would hurt him, yet all night long I've been tormented by terrifying dreams of him. My baby. He's hidden away somewhere, helpless and suffering, and I can't get to him. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Chapter 11. Ellison to join us right away. We've no time to waste. Camden hesitated, casting a brief glance at the inspector before he finally relented. Very well, I'll fetch him, he mumbled, retreating toward the door with reluctance. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of frustration and concern etched on his face. Can you believe it? What if Ellison has something to hide? The way Camden reacted, it's as if he's been sworn to silence. We need every scrap of information we can get. McCarty nodded, his gaze steely. True enough, but let's not jump to conclusions without a reason. There's more to this than meets the eye. The two men stood in tense silence for a moment, the air thick with unease. Then the inspector cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. Boys, we have to be careful. There's a reason this case feels off. We're dealing with someone who's unpredictable, possibly dangerous. Marcus leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Then we need to figure out what the connection is between that man in the alley and Nathan's disappearance. There's a thread here that goes deeper. Just then the door swung open, and Ellison stepped in, his face drawn and weary. What's going on? I was told to come here immediately. Without wasting a moment, McCarty gestured for him to sit. We need to talk about the incident in the alley. It might be more relevant than you realized. Ellison's expression shifted, caught between surprise and alarm. What incident? The man who took hold of your son not long ago, Marcus interjected, his tone urgent. We have reason to believe it might be linked to Nathan's disappearance. Ellison's demeanor changed, the weight of the conversation pressing down hard. But I thought that was nothing, some random act. Why would it matter now? Because it's not just a coincidence, McCarty replied, leaning forward. This is far too connected for it to be mere happenstance. We need every detail you recall about that event. Anything you saw or heard could be the key. Ellison ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fear swirling in his eyes. I'll tell you what I remember, but I don't see how it can help. Just trust us on this, Marcus urged, his voice firm. We're running out of time. As Ellison prepared to speak, the tension in the room coiled tighter, each man acutely aware of the looming threat that haunted their investigation. Ellison will be here later, McCarty said. Now, Inspector, before we get into it, let's follow my suggestion just this once more. There's a train Martin needs to catch, and he has to hurry to make it. The inspector studied him thoughtfully for a moment, before giving a curt nod. Go on, then, he said. Get the instructions, Martin. McCarty pulled the young operative aside, and after a quick exchange, Martin headed off. The inspector then gestured for the other two to enter the library and shut the door behind them. I need an explanation for all this, he declared, his voice bringing McCarty back to their earlier days together. Why didn't you inform me the moment you learned what was going on? What have you two been up to since? I made you deputies, but I certainly didn't promote you to chiefs. McCarty recounted their activities from the previous night in detail, adding honestly, I didn't report it to you, Inspector, because I wanted a head start, and that's the truth. So far, I've been doing what I believe you would have done, but I'm approaching it from a different angle that you wouldn't have considered. I just sent Martin to Ellenville to see if Blaisdell has any word on the boy, but that's just standard procedure. The real work is right here in the mall, even if Nathan shows up somewhere else, dead or alive. What's this angle of yours? The inspector asked sharply. What did Ellison prevent that tutor from mentioning, and why? McCarty explained the conversation with Mrs. Ellison, and the inspector listened intently. Once he finished, the inspector asked, What's your plan? Are you going to push Ellison to find out why he kept that information to himself? He can't possibly be involved in the kidnapping of his own son. No, McCarty replied, but he thinks he knows who was behind it, and he expects to hear from this person or those supporting him soon regarding a ransom. He's willing to offer a reward of 50 to 100,000 as soon as you give the word. Until he hears from him, he can't be certain what happened to the boy, and that's why he's so anxious. His wife knows nothing of his private thoughts on the matter, of course, and naturally she's half out of her mind, McCarty concluded, as if his reasoning was just as clear to his two companions. We'll let him fret a bit. I truly believe he's mistaken. I want to take a look inside that vacant house next to the Websters across the street, and we can't waste any time waiting for formal permission. The Quentin house. It's been closed for years, hasn't it? The inspector fixed his gaze on him, and Marcus stared in disbelief. You think the guy might have hidden out there after he let the little boy go? Let's take a chance. A large, dark blue limousine, striking in appearance, was just arriving at number 7 as they stepped out of the Ellison house and crossed the street. Upon seeing the distinguished, grey-bearded man who climbed out and walked up the steps, the inspector stopped with a gasp. Do you know who that is, Ty? The ambassador who just received the keys to the city from the mayor yesterday at City Hall. If he's here to visit the Webster family, they must be of even more importance than I thought. No wonder they don't bother with the rest of the block, millionaires or not, McCarty remarked, eyeing the vehicle with great respect as they walked by. You mentioned the old gentleman was. He suddenly paused, and Marcus followed his gaze to the grand entrance doors, which were slowly closing behind the ambassador's aristocratic figure. For a brief moment, there was a glimpse of a thin, sallow-faced manservant in black, who seemed to scrutinize the trio with a strangely piercing stare before the scene vanished from view. McCarty seemed to have lost interest in the question he was about to ask, and they moved on in silence to the narrow, paved alley between the Webster residence and the sprawling brownstone next door. Let's head up this way and see if the back is open for the length of the block, like it is on the other side of the street, McCarty suggested. There's the side door of the Websters, the one Nathan said the man vanished into. It's quite deep, you see, deep enough that he could have just stepped into the recess and stayed hidden in the shadows of the late afternoon without even going through the door itself. Though I'm not saying he didn't do that. It's unlikely that someone who goes around grabbing kids and rifling through their pockets would be let into the Websters, Marcus exclaimed with disdain. Unless the boy completely made this up for attention, like some kids do, how would the man have gotten in and out of this block? The house on this side looks boarded up, as tight as a drum. They reached the back and found the open courtyard extending behind the houses to be even wider than that on the south side of the street, with the back wall towering higher and lacking any vines. The silent Quentin house appeared as barren from the back as it did from the front, its boarded-up windows and locked doors staring like blind eyes in the sunlight. The inspector shook his head. No one has entered this place in months, maybe even years, he remarked. The padlocks on those boarded doors are so rusted they would need to be broken, and the boards themselves are weathered and rotting. I'm surprised they've let it get in such a condition, even though it's embroiled in litigation. What are you doing, Riordan? The house, being the corner property, was built with an extension on the Madison Avenue side, and in the right angle formed by its two walls, a downspout descended from the roof. Marcus was examining it, testing it thoughtfully. At the inspector's question, he turned. Do you mind, sir? There was a wide, shiny mark polished on a pipe running across the top of an air shaft that showed Ty and me how a murderer swung himself down on a rope, and into a window during the first case he got involved in after leaving the force, he explained. This rain pipe looks too fragile to hold the weight of a cat, but it wasn't a cat that rubbed the rust off here and here, making it shine like new tin. I put on a clean shirt yesterday, which is a shame, but hold my coat and hat, Ty. Be careful, or you'll break your neck, McCarty warned, momentarily forgetting his friend's profession as he complied. Marcus didn't reply, instead scaling the creaking, straining leader up to the second floor, swinging out to land lightly and sure-footedly on the broad sill of a window just 2 feet away. The leader, suddenly freed from his weight, tore loose from its fastening and tilted wildly against the wall, shaking and clattering. McCarty exclaimed, You won't be coming down the way you went up. True enough, Marcus called back, a note of excitement in his voice. I'll be coming down the way the last guy did who went in here, and that's from the inside. Wait for me. He had been examining the sill he stood on and the boards covering the window, pressing on them as he tested their strength. Suddenly, one of them gave way, forcing inward with a loud crash as the glass shattered. "Now you've done it," McCarty remarked unnecessarily. "Be careful, there might not be anyone else waiting for you inside." "I've got my flashlight, thank goodness, and my 2 fists," Marcus replied confidently. "That board wasn't secure, the nails were just pushed back into the holes. Here goes another." With a great tearing sound, the second board followed the first, and with a third that he wrenched free, Marcus smashed the remaining glass still clinging to the frame, then wriggled nimbly through the opening and vanished from sight. McCarty took a deep breath and turned to his former boss. "I'd love to go after him," he said with longing. "If someone is hiding in there, the same one who took the boy, he'll be desperate enough to kill, and Max is too slow-witted and slow on his feet to look after himself. I'm bigger than he is, and it's been ages since I climbed anything, but maybe I could manage that pipe after all." "A man with 4 medals from the fire department for bravery and outstanding service doesn't need a babysitter, Ty," the inspector replied with a laugh. "Honestly, I doubt anyone's been in there for months before him, but what's that?" At that moment, a muffled commotion echoed from within, a prolonged clatter followed by a heavy thud, then an eerie silence that felt heavy with tension. "I knew it." McCarty dropped his hat and coat, rushing toward the wooden barrier sealing the main back door. "I'm going in, even if I have to break the whole place down. Max, I'm coming." His spirited shout was overwhelmed by the sound of his fist crashing into the rotting boards. But after his first strike, the inspector caught up to him and pulled him back. "Have you lost your mind?" the inspector exclaimed. "You'll wake up the whole neighborhood with this breaking and entering. Riordan's fine. Listen, I think I hear someone moving inside." McCarty paused, breathless and on edge, and faintly he could hear the sound of unsteady footsteps inside, along with a scratching noise from a window to the left of the door, which had been left unbarred behind the iron grillwork. A heavy green shade hung close to the inside of the grimy windowpane, stained by countless rainstorms, and at a glance the strong bars seemed firmly set in the wide stone sill. But McCarty stepped up to them and began testing each one, while the inspector drew his revolver and readied himself for anything. "Look here, sir," McCarty whispered. "They sure don't have much for security in these houses. Look how this bar slides neatly into its groove at the top of the window frame. You can pull it out from below and lower it completely over the sill. I bet the next one will work just as smoothly. And it does. If only we'd bothered to discover this earlier. Goodness, here, Max himself." The green shade flipped up, revealing Marcus's face illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of his flashlight, but he quickly turned it off and began working on the window latch. As McCarty removed the 4th bar, the window slid open upward. The 2 of them, who had just been exchanging meaningful grimaces, gazed at each other in silence for a full minute. Finally, McCarty broke the silence. "Where is he?" he demanded. "What did you do with him? We heard the commotion out here." "There wasn't any him," Marcus interrupted, a bit sheepishly. "It was just me. I came down the stairs unexpectedly and managed the whole flight without even breaking my flashlight. But come on in, both of you, and see what I've found." McCarty climbed over the sill, and Inspector Lucien, despite his years, followed with the agility of a youth. They entered a large room devoid of furniture, but the dust covering the floor lay heavily like a carpet, revealing a winding trail of footsteps that had been walked many times. The tracks led from the window where they had entered to a door that opened into a laundry. Dusty fingerprints, and sometimes the outline of an entire hand, were clearly marked on the white woodwork of the inner sill, with greasy pieces of wrapping paper scattered beneath it. In one corner, 2 pitchers and several small tin cans were piled up. "Clearly, someone has been camping out here," the inspector said. "They've been getting their meals passed through that window, too." "And it wasn't just any ordinary store-bought food," McCarty noted as he rummaged through the papers. Look here, there's the remains of a whole chicken, bits of fancy rolls and pastry, and other items, but it's all stale. It's been here for at least 4 or 5 days. And there are traces of coffee in those pitchers and cans, not to mention the wine bottles on that shelf, Marcus pointed out impatiently. He's been living well, likely helping himself from one of the houses in this row, and the closer, the better, even if it happens to be occupied by the Websters. Come upstairs. I want to show you more. The larger adjoining room had clearly been a laundry, with rows of enameled tubs and washing machines lined up against the wall, and dryers scattered about, all covered in a thick layer of dust. Marcus led the way through a series of kitchens and pantries that were far more elaborate than those they had seen in Orbit's house, until they reached the back stairs and climbed to the second-floor rear, entering the room with the broken window. They had followed a zigzag trail of overlapping footsteps, and here the floor was crisscrossed by a web of them. This space had clearly once been one of the master bedrooms, as it featured a well-appointed, marble-lined bathroom that opened off from it, and heavy, old-fashioned furniture of richly carved mahogany was arranged with precise formality around the room. A half-burned candle, shielded from the window by a cardboard box cover, sat on a side table along with a handful of matches and some discarded cigarette stubs. McCarty pointed to it. He couldn't get by without a light, but he hid it from the window and was afraid to carry it when he went down to get his food. That's why those footprints are so scattered. He was trying to navigate in the dark. The bed looked as though it had recently been slept in, with all those old drapes piled on it. And what's in that big pitcher on the dresser? Water, Marcus answered. There's still a little left, but you can see the marks inside where it has dried up. Evaporated, the inspector nodded. That suggests whoever it was hasn't used any in a few days at least. Wait, what's this? He turned to the bathroom, and after a moment, emerged holding a shiny new razor, a bar of soap, and a quite dirty Turkish towel. The water has been shut off in the pipes, of course, but there's an empty bucket in there, so someone must have brought him some. He seems to have cared about his appearance at least. Didn't the Ellison boy say that the man who confronted him looked rough and unshaven? When he confronted him, yes, McCarty replied. He had plenty of time to clean up afterward, as soon as whoever was helping him to hide brought him those things. He did more than that, Marcus stated, a rare flush coloring his leathery cheeks, his grey eyes bright with excitement. Why do you think he was hiding here? What drives someone to hide? If it's not to do something illegal, couldn't he have already broken the law and be on the run? Max, McCarty exclaimed softly. What are you implying? You've discovered something. Who is this man? Who's wanted now, Inspector? Marcus asked. Someone gentlemanly enough to keep himself shaved and clean despite everything, someone who would appreciate good food and fine wine, yet still a convicted criminal. Convicted, McCarty moved forward quickly. An ex-con, you mean? How did you figure that out? Ex-con, my foot, his companion shot back. I might not keep up with the latest prison trends, but if this isn't a prison outfit, then I'm the Queen of England. He threw open a closet door behind him, leaped inside, and triumphantly pulled out a telltale suit, stained and tattered in grey. Sing Sing, exclaimed Inspector Lucien. Good heavens, Riordan, you really struck gold. Remember, Ty, there were 3 men who escaped last month. One was killed while trying to flee, and another got caught and was sent to Dannemora, but the third one who broke out is still on the loose, and there's a hefty reward out for him. I can't imagine how he got into the mall, or why he would end up here of all places, but I'll bet my life that the man hiding in this house is George Radley. Chapter 12. Who is he? Marcus asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Who is this George Radley? You remember, don't you, Ty? The inspector turned to the former roundsman. Radley was a young chemist. A chemist, McCarty and Marcus chorused, their voices rising in surprise. Then they fell quiet, exchanging startled glances. What's gotten into you two? Inspector Lucien demanded. Radley was accused, along with an accomplice, of sending poison hidden in candy to a common enemy. An innocent person in the man's household ended up eating it and died, but the evidence against them was so flimsy that they could only be convicted of manslaughter after 2 hung juries. The accomplice received a sentence of 2 or 3 years, while Radley got 10. He still has quite a bit of time left to serve, especially considering he was involved in an incident where a guard got seriously injured trying to stop a riot. So, he's wanted badly. He couldn't have made it to the city dressed like that. He must have had other clothes, whether he stole them or someone slipped them to him, Marcus said as he moved back to the closet. He pulled out a pair of worn shoes, grey trousers, a long Mackinaw coat, and a soft Panama hat. The shoes are in bad shape, but the rest is in decent condition, and there's an umbrella in the corner of the closet. He could have slipped past the watchman easily on a rainy night, especially if he claimed he was visiting a maid in one of the houses. Still, that doesn't explain why he would grab the Ellison kid, if it was him, and go through his pockets. His clothes might be a significant find, but we haven't located him yet. What if he's hiding under this roof right now? McCarty exclaimed. He wouldn't have any reason to harm the Ellison boy unless Nathan discovered he was here and planned to expose him. But regardless of his intentions, he hasn't had a chance to escape. You're right, Ty. The inspector dropped the clothes he had been inspecting and headed for the door. We'll flush him out. But after an exhaustive search of the vast house, from the attic to the cellar, they found no sign of the fugitive. At last, they exited through the open basement window, rounded the corner, and came face to face with James Jennings. Mr. Webster's butler from next door sent me, the watchman explained. He mentioned someone heard a noise and thought I should check it out. Is everything all right, Inspector? His curiosity was evident, but the official replied curtly, Everything's fine. We'll check the other empty houses on the block later. What's this we've been hearing about a strange man who frightened the Ellison boy in this very courtyard not 2 weeks ago? McCarty inquired as they walked back to the sidewalk. James Jennings shifted uncomfortably. There was no strange man that came through these gates while I was here, he insisted defensively. It must have been some butler or worker from the block playing a prank on the kid. It was the Saturday before last that he made a fuss about it, but there wasn't any sign of the rough-looking fellow he described when Mr. Camden and I searched. We checked every inch of the courtyard. Oh, look, there's Mr. Orbit waving at us. However, it was the inspector and his team that Orbit signaled to. Once they approached, he asked with serious concern, Is it true that Nathan Ellison is missing? One of the maids from next door told Clara and said you had been informed, but I couldn't believe it. Camden came to my house yesterday afternoon asking about him, but I forgot. McCarty and Riordan were there too. Is it possible that the little boy hasn't been seen at all? Not that we've been able to uncover, the inspector replied. It's quite a troubling situation. If he were a healthy, mischievous child, we might think he simply ran away, but from what we've gathered, he was sickly and shy, not the type to venture off on his own. Nathan is very anxious and highly sensitive, with remarkable artistic potential, Orbit noted thoughtfully. I find him immensely interesting, and my friend Blaisdell believes that he could become a great painter someday, provided his family doesn't stifle his dreams with their indifference. He's like a delicate plant that needs encouragement and care. But what could have happened to him? If he's not with friends or family, the poor child must have had an accident. Has an alert been sent out? We're doing everything we can to find him. He used to come and go from your house quite a bit, right? Did he ever mention anyone he might have gone to see? The inspector inquired. We know how disappointed he was when his parents wouldn't let him join this Mr. Blaisdell on a sketching trip, but he seems to have moved past it. Do you know if he had any friends his own age? Orbit shook his head. None. He's a solitary little lad, quite reserved and introverted, and I don't think he values the company of other boys much. He wouldn't have left without a word if he were able to communicate with his family. It's baffling. Ellison must be heartbroken over this, not to mention the boy's mother, and I feel terrible myself. I can't bear the thought of anything happening to him. I'm going to see Ellison to see if there's anything I can do. Meanwhile, you don't have any updates for me about Griffith's strange death, do you? It's strange that two such mysterious, unrelated incidents could happen within a week. Griffith must have ingested the poison accidentally or due to someone's foul play after he left the mall that night. Have you found the slightest clue? We're following up on a few promising leads. The answer came in a slightly weary tone. We'll keep you informed if we find anything worthwhile, Mr. Orbit. Come on, Ty. It's almost noon. Orbit turned toward the Ellison house, but the others had barely taken half a dozen steps in the opposite direction when they were stopped again. This time, it was the pretty little French nurse, who drew the Thorn baby closer to her as she looked at McCarty with wide, frightened eyes and asked her question. "Excuse me, sir, but is it true what I've heard? Is it that the little boy from that house is lost?" "That's about the gist of it, ma'am," McCarty replied, tipping his reblocked derby with a flourish. "I suppose you didn't see him playing around anywhere yesterday afternoon, did you?" "Oh, no," she gasped, slightly catching her breath. "He has been gone all night. How terrible. He is so gentle, so sweet, the little Nathan. He wouldn't run away, could he have been kidnapped. I fear for little Maud." She hugged the small child tighter, and the baby looked at them solemnly. "There isn't much chance of that," McCarty said with a reassuring laugh. "I'm sure the boy will turn up just fine. When did you last see him?" "Yesterday morning, when he was with Monsieur Camden. Oh, if he has been taken, we haven't a chance beyond these gates." She nodded and slowly took the child away, while Marcus commented, "She's lovely and well-spoken, but have you ever heard such strange language? It's no wonder those French end up confused when they talk. They're just trying to understand each other." McCarty glanced quickly at the troubled frown on the inspector's face, and then replied to his companion. "But she had it right, though. Nathan has really left us now, and if we don't bring him back soon, the chief is going to raise a bigger fuss than ever. Isn't that what you're thinking, sir?" The inspector nodded, looking somber. "I'm heading to the agents responsible for these houses to get the keys." He pointed toward the two closed homes to the east of Mrs. Thorne. "In the meantime, try to find out who provided food to the man hiding over there and what happened to him. Meet me back here in an hour." "It doesn't seem like much he wants," Marcus said, as the inspector turned on his heel and strode toward the gate. "Still, if we could track down where those wine bottles came from that were stacked on the shelf in that empty house. Look, the ambassador's limousine is pulling away." The sleek dark blue car was indeed gliding slowly away from the curb in front of the Webster house, the grand front door closing behind it. They caught another fleeting glimpse of the pale-faced manservant before McCarty exclaimed, "Let's go. I need to have a word with the butler over there anyway, and maybe even the old gentleman himself. Don't interfere, Max. I know what I'm doing." Marcus followed in silence, still feeling frustrated as they climbed the steps of the grand house and rang the bell. They waited a long moment, and just as McCarty was about to ring again, the door swung open abruptly, revealing the same manservant they had seen moments before. He ignored Marcus, his dull, sunken eyes fixing on McCarty, and as he stared, his pale cheeks seemed to lose even more color. "Hello, Porter." "I see you remember me," McCarty said breezily. "My friend and I would like to have a quick chat with you." "My name isn't Porter, it's Roberts," the man replied stiffly, obviously trying to maintain his composure. "You've got the wrong person." "I assure you you're mistaken, my lad," McCarty said with a laid-back confidence. "Inspector Lucien already caught you the other day, but he let you off then because we didn't know what we know now." "By God, you won't pin anything on me again," the man recoiled, his voice turning sharp and raw. "You don't have anything on me." "Really, what about your neighbor who has been staying next door for the last week?" McCarty pressed, watching Marcus hold his breath. "Listen, Roberts, I know you've been under pressure, and I don't want to be too hard on you, but I'm going to find out the truth." "Neighbor," the man known as Roberts wet his parched lips. "I don't have a clue what you're talking about." "Perhaps Mr. Webster knows. We can ask him." McCarty moved as if to push past the trembling figure, and the man raised his hands in protest. For heaven's sake, don't do that, especially when he's giving me my only fair chance. It was more of a pained whisper than anything else. I'm Porter, sure, but he knows it. He knows I was set up, and you officers wouldn't let me get straight afterward. That's why he took me in. I don't know what you're after, but don't drag him into this. What do you want from me? McCarty cast a glance down the long hallway that seemed almost empty in its stark elegance, despite the opulent carvings and charming old furniture. Let's go somewhere we can talk without interruptions, McCarty suggested. This is for your own good, if you come clean. I've heard that line before, Porter shrugged, a faint trace of a weary smile flickering across his face. You can follow me back to my pantry if you want, but why not just take me downtown now and get it over with? If you're trying to frame me, cut the theatrics. Did I ever, McCarty shot back, did I ever try to set you or anyone else up without having the real facts? I suppose not, Ty. I don't have anything against you, but I've had a rough time. What's happening now is just the luck of the draw, I guess. He carefully shut the pantry door behind them and gestured toward the chairs. He leaned back against the table, gripping its edge with his slender fingers. What do you want to know? I'll be honest about myself. McCarty noticed the slight hesitation and quickly asked, How long have you been out this time? 1.5 years. My health took a turn for the worse, and I would have been done for if I hadn't gotten pardoned, but what good did that do me? Every time I found a job at a drugstore, someone from the narcotics squad showed up with my record, and I was out the door. That record, God. And I wasn't even guilty. I never knew my boss was crooked and involved with the dope ring, making me the fall guy. His voice grew rough with a kind of fierce passion. I was nearly at my breaking point, but the man who got me pardoned was always watching over me and noticed how hard I was trying. That's why Mr. Webster gave me a chance here to catch my breath. Is there anything else you want to know about me? Yes, McCarty said, struck by a sudden thought. You were tried with Radley, right? Convicted for sending that poisoned candy. He paused, and Porter shrugged again. What's the joke? You got that from headquarters, and nobody's keeping it a secret. It was that old charge, the record of that first case that convicted me again, and it helped convict Radley too, for we were both innocent. But what's the point in telling you that now? There's a lot of reason to tell us, for your own sake, what you had to do with the incident last month. Nothing. I haven't stepped foot outside these gates since I arrived in June. So you didn't know anything about it until Radley showed up here a couple of weeks ago. I still don't know anything except what I've read in the papers. Porter looked him straight in the eye. What do you mean about Radley showing up? You didn't hide him in that empty house next door and sneak food, drinks, a razor, and clothes to him, did you? McCarty hesitated for a moment, but Porter remained stubbornly silent. He continued, Does Benjamin Webster know about this? He'll be shocked to find out that after taking you in, you've made him an accessory after a crime. He's not an accessory to anything, Porter interrupted. I know the law all too well. He's a good, decent man who believes in giving everyone a fair chance, especially those who have been wronged. But he wouldn't do anything against the law, even if he thinks it's unjust. You've got no proof that Radley was here or that anyone helped him hide, but I'm just glad he got away, glad. I pray he's never caught to go back to that hell. Even if it means you go down now, McCarty pressed. You have one chance to stay out of this, Porter, and you won't be betraying Radley either. We already know you helped him hide and make his escape, but it's not Radley we're after, at least not right now. We're focused on another matter entirely. We just need to find out when he left the mall and how he got away. I never promised anything that I didn't keep, and I'm telling you now that neither I nor Riordan will give a hint about your involvement in this mess. You mean you're not here to set me up or trick me into ratting out Radley? A flicker of hope sparked in his voice as he searched the honest, solid face before him. You've got a reputation for fairness, Ty, and you know enough already to get me locked up again if you wanted to, so what I say shouldn't matter. It won't hurt George, Radley either, for that matter. Marcus jumped at the sudden change, and McCarty asked, Why wouldn't it? You don't mean he's dead, do you? I don't know any more than you do about when he left or how he got out, and that's the honest truth, Porter replied slowly, his gaunt, pale face twitching. I read about his escape in the papers, just like I told you, and when days passed without him being caught, I was relieved, thinking he'd made a clean getaway. But I never imagined he'd show up here. One late afternoon, doesn't matter how long ago, I opened the side door and found him practically leaning against it, weak from hunger and thirst, and really panicking. He'd slipped past the watchman during a rainstorm a night or two earlier to try and reach me, his old friend, and had been hiding in that empty house next door without food or water, too scared to come openly and ask for me. When I didn't appear, he decided to leave, but he realized he couldn't get out as easily as he got in, and he was nearly frantic. That must have been a week ago last Saturday, McCarty nodded. When you found him, he was just grabbing a kid from the block here, searching his pockets to see if the boy had a key to the gates. Good heavens, Marcus gasped under his breath. Yes. He was out of his mind, but he didn't hurt the boy at all. He just frightened him. I made him return to the house next door and stay hidden until the search was over. After dark, I brought him some bread, meat, and a bottle of rare old port from the cellar. I knew it was wrong. It didn't seem fitting for all the kindness the old gentleman had shown me, but George really needed it, and I felt I owed him that much. He needed clothes too, but luckily my things fit him. I didn't even have to steal money for him, since the old gentleman paid me well, and I hadn't any place to spend it anyway. The real problem was getting him through the gates. After the scare he caused, the watchmen were wary of strangers. If they stopped him and started asking questions, I knew he'd break down from all the tension he had been under, and that would be the end of him. Porter reached for a silver jug of ice water on the table beside him and took a long drink, replacing it with a sigh of relief. Only the families have keys, and of course, I couldn't borrow Miss Webster's or her niece, Miss Hester. The old gentleman kept his key on a ring and slept with it under his pillow. I tried twice to take it, but he woke up both times. I had a tough time explaining what I was doing in his room, and I didn't dare risk it again. George was getting anxious with all the waiting and worry, sneaking out at night despite my warnings. I was getting pretty desperate myself when suddenly he vanished, and that's all I know. He squared his narrow shoulders, as if a burden had been lifted from them, and McCarty stood up. When did you see him last? Late Sunday night, when I went to bring him some food. I passed it through the window, and we spoke for a moment, but I couldn't stay any longer. George was on the verge of giving himself up. He had lost all his resolve, and it took all my strength to convince him to hold on just a bit longer. We had decided that I would visit him every other night. I couldn't take the risk of going more often, so I made sure not to miss him on Monday. Last night, I brought some rolls, a cold pheasant, and a half-bottle of Burgundy, waiting beneath his window for as long as I could manage, but he never showed. Eventually, I removed the loose iron bars and slipped inside. There wasn't a flicker of light from his candle, and when I took a chance and called out to him, there was no response. I left the food and left, but I spent the entire night worrying, and by morning I went back to retrieve the untouched meal. I feared the cook might notice the missing pheasant, and that it would lead to trouble. I didn't even think about the wine bottles. So, he could have escaped any time from Sunday night onward. That's right. I'm telling you the straight truth, Ty. I knew when I saw you an hour ago that you'd come looking for me eventually, especially after Miss Webster. The old gentleman's sister, Miss Priscilla, heard a noise next door and told me to alert the watchman. I thought we were finished last week when Inspector Lucien arrived, but he was only there about that valet from across the street who was poisoned, and he didn't even act like he recognized me. Do you know the kid that Radley tried to get a key from? McCarty dismissed the previous comment. Only by sight. He's the one with red hair, right? He lives next to where that valet used to work. I see him walk by now and then across the street. Have you seen him since that incident? Oh, yes, Porter chuckled lightly, slightly surprised. Just a day or so ago. George hadn't intended to frighten him. He wouldn't hurt a soul. But the thought of those gates closing around him, trapping him as if he were back up the river, nearly drove him mad. You've been here since June, have you, Porter? Did you know the valet who passed away? No, I think I saw him with the butler from the house next door, but I don't want to get acquainted with any of them. I've been perfectly content to stay here and do a servant's job until I can gather the courage to seek a position among my own people again where I won't be shuffled around. He smiled again, but it was bitter. I suppose that's not happening now that you're involved, but I wouldn't change it for anything. I'd do it all over again for George. He was just as innocent as I am, and look at what they did to him. If I find out you're being honest with me, I'll keep my promise, Porter, McCarty said, as he moved toward the door, with Marcus following closely. You may not realize it, but I'm no longer on the force, nor do I have any ties to headquarters, except to drop by every now and then for old time's sake. The inspector didn't recognize you the other day. He felt he knew your face, but couldn't quite place you. Riordan and I will just pretend you didn't see Radley, unless it comes to a confrontation, and then we'll do what we can to help you. Cutting off the ex-convict stammered thanks. They stepped out to find Inspector Lucien pacing anxiously back and forth in front of the two shuttered houses across the street, forcing Marcus to keep his thoughts on their recent discussion to himself. Did you get anything useful from Webster? The inspector asked. We didn't even catch sight of him, McCarty replied. I was trying to gather information on the staff. Do you remember saying you'd seen one or two of them before? Have you figured out where? Goodness, no. I've had far too much else on my mind. I had a feeling that one of the housemaids and the page boy who runs errands looked familiar, but there wasn't anything particularly remarkable about them. Marcus coughed, and McCarty quickly added, I doubt any of them knows what happened to the man hiding next door or anything about the Ellison boy, and that's all that really matters at the moment, right, sir? Did you manage to get the keys to those houses? Yes, and I had to explain it all over again to that clueless watchman, Jennings. I had a chance to thoroughly inspect the outside while I waited for you, and I couldn't find any signs of tampering with the windows or doors. Let's check what's inside. 1 o'clock had come and gone, and after another hour they finally emerged from the second house, having found nothing of value. All they encountered in the vast, echoing, partially dismantled rooms was dust and mold, and the only recent signs of life were the boot prints they left behind. Marcus blinked against the sunlight and took a deep breath of the fresh air. It's like emerging from a tomb, he exclaimed. What's our next move, Inspector? I'm going to confront Ellison and get him to talk, the inspector replied with a grim determination in his voice. Until he shares his suspicions about who kidnapped the boy, we're stuck, and every hour is crucial. You two should grab a bite to eat and meet me at his house later. They were more than willing to take the hint. It was mid-afternoon when they returned to the east gate of the mall, only to find Jennings vigorously trying to drive away a burly vendor of toy balloons. The vendor's basket, filled with bright, crude-colored globes bobbing on slender sticks, resembled a patch of strange, distorted flowers uprooted from a garden. They're a nuisance, those peddlers, Jennings declared as he let them in, but they're not nearly as bothersome as the reporters who have been trying to get in since you left. Hey, did you hear that Nathan Ellison is missing? Of course we know, McCarty cut in. Didn't Camden tell you that himself yesterday afternoon? Now, come on, Max. Leaving the watchman speechless, they hurried toward the Ellison house. As they passed the entrance of Orbit's, the door swung open, and Wei Anya rushed out. For once, the usually stoic man was anything but calm. His eyes were darting around, his face twisted in fear, and his long braid flew out behind him as he dashed down the steps, grabbing McCarty with a strong grip, his long fingers like claws. The nurse baby, he stammered, his voice high and frantic. The French maid next door, hurry. Isolde, you mean, the Thorn child's nurse, McCarty stopped. Quit chattering and tell me where she is and what's going on. Isolde, Wei Anya nodded vigorously, pointing toward the open windows of the conservatory. She is next. She has breathed the breath of death.